There were a lot of pretty great video games that released in the 2010s, but not every release was a success. Games can flop for a lot of different reasons, and as we entered the modern era of gaming, that list of reasons expanded to include exciting new ways for gamers and studios alike to be disappointed. Some were victims of circumstance, while others took a risk on a niche concept. Still more fell prey to consumer backlash over new monetization schemes or other unpopular choices. And of course, there were always those where, well, let's just say they got what they deserved. We'll start with this category. Make the bad guys cry like an anime fan on prom night. That was the cringe-inducing closing sales pitch for Mighty No. 9, an action platformer that was first announced via the launching of a Kickstarter campaign 3 years earlier. Led by Keiji Inafune, famed creator of the Mega Man series way back in the 80s, fans were excited to see what he could do with the concept without heavy-handed involvement from Capcom. So excited, in fact, that the Kickstarter campaign reached full funding, $900,000 in just 2 days. Ambitious stretch goals were added and the total continued to climb, eventually reaching over $4 million. Hype levels were through the roof and stayed that way until no fewer than 3 significant delays poured some cold water on the whole project. The delays left a bad taste in everyone's mouth, but the debacle was made so much worse in 2015 when Inafune launched a new Kickstarter for a completely different spiritual successor to Mega Man called Red Ash. Backers of Mighty No. 9 felt completely bamboozled, but the decision was defended by producer Nick Yu, who said, "People are still working on Mighty No. 9, but other teams are just doing nothing, so we need to move those teams onto new projects. Sometimes that can generate payments, generate their salaries." We had this idea for a while about Red Ash, and we thought, why not do another Kickstarter? When the game finally did come out, it was pretty meh. The 3D visuals were generic and plasticky and far below expectations for a modern game. The narrative was charmless, the voice acting, especially the English dub, was actually just annoying, and much of the content felt recycled or lacking in originality. And as for the marketing, that trailer with the line about anime fans unsurprisingly did not go over well. It's really something to behold, and we at Early Epoch highly recommend that you check it out for yourself if you're up for a laugh, or maybe some secondhand embarrassment. We'll drop a link in the description if you want to check it out. Anyway, the failure of Mighty No. 9 was a pretty big blow to Inafune's fledgling concept studio, which was sold off to Level 5 the following year. Released in 2010, APB All Points Bulletin was an absolute disaster for developer Real-Time Worlds and publisher EA when it was shut down just months after launch due to low subscriber numbers and a dreadful reception from both players and critics. That is, once critics were allowed to speak. You see, a review embargo was placed on critics that lasted a full week after the game came out. Embargoes are nothing new, but the idea that one lasted until a full week after the game came out justifiably destroyed any trust in the studio. Real-Time Worlds tried to justify this, saying, "Before finalizing reviews, we want you to experience the full, rich experience of APB as it's meant to be seen. We want you to see wild customer customizations, player progression, and clans making an impact on the living, breathing city of Sanparo." Well, unfortunately, even after experiencing the full, rich experience, everyone agreed that the game was just plain bad. The core gameplay was repetitive, with missions feeling monotonous and lacking depth, while combat and driving were described as chores. Weapons and mechanics were unbalanced, such as overpowered SMGs or faction-specific vehicle disadvantages, and all this made the experience frustrating and unfair, especially for new players. Making matters worse, the game was plagued by rampant cheating and hackers who frequently ruined matches for legit players. Real-Time Worlds filed for bankruptcy soon after, and while the game was revived as free-to-play under new ownership, the damage was done and it was mostly fading into obscurity by that point. Interestingly though, you can still try it out today as of 2025. The year is 1997. Wannabe by Spice Girls is topping the charts, President Bill Clinton is having a good time in the White House, and Titanic is making history as the highest grossing film of all time. You're a pretty young man, maybe you're 28 years old, like Duke Nukem creator Ton Replogle was at the time, and you're working at game developer 3D Realms. Things have never been better, and you're riding high following the release of your latest big hit game, Duke Nukem 3D. Naturally, you get to work almost immediately on a sequel. Little do you know, by the time this game comes out, you'll be over 40 years old and Baby Spice won't be far behind. This was the unfortunate fate of Duke Nukem Forever, which at that time held the dubious distinction of having officially the longest development for any single game of all time. There's literally a whole 3,500-word Wikipedia article dedicated to summarizing the saga that was this game's development, but suffice it to say, it involved 4 different dev studios, multiple engine changes, huge personnel shifts, including more than half the team leaving the company in frustration in addition to further layoffs, publisher conflicts, and even legal battles. When the game finally did launch, it wasn't half bad, if only it had released 10 years earlier. Unfortunately, by 2011, the world was a pretty different place, with much of the colorful humor just seeming kinda cringe, the cultural relevance of the protagonist largely forgotten, and worst of all, the graphics and gameplay were outdated, killing what fun even dedicated fans of the series tried to find in the game. Body Count was a first-person shooter released by Codemasters, which was so bad it resulted in the closure of their entire Guildford, England studio, which at that point made up a third of their development capacity. Sounds pretty bleak, right? Surprisingly, the game wasn't actually that bad according to some retrospectives, especially the cover mechanics and graphics, which overall are seen as okay. But considering the release year of 2011, with entries from huge series like Gears of War, Battlefield, and Call of Duty coming out at the same time, an FPS had to be really good to stand out in the crowd. And Body Count just didn't make the cut. The gameplay was criticized as repetitive, the storytelling was extremely lacking, and the admittedly half-decent graphics were marred by a muddy art style and frequent frame drops due to poor optimization. Creative director Stuart Black left halfway through development, blaming the studio itself for the ultimate negative outcome. He said in an interview, "My decision to leave Codemasters and Body Count was the hardest choice of my career. It was clear that Codemasters were unable or unwilling to provide the support needed to realize the vision I had for Body Count." Bit of a controversial take with this one, because some argue, and always have done, that Epic Mickey 2 isn't such a bad game, but for a few poor design decisions. Chief among them was the sloppy execution of a new co-op mechanic, with Mickey Mouse and Oswald the Lucky Rabbit adventuring together for the first time. Unfortunately, the AI controlling Oswald when he wasn't being played by a second player was often unresponsive or erratic, leading to very frustrating gameplay. Critics noted that Oswald's actions felt like a hindrance rather than a help, and this undermined the cooperative aspect, especially for solo players. There were also many technical problems, including glitches, frame rate drops, and clunky controls. The camera system was widely criticized for being unwieldy, often obstructing views or failing to follow the action smoothly. Despite all this, Epic Mickey 2 might have still been considered an okay game if such a high bar hadn't been set by the first entry. By comparison, the sequel's levels were considered uninspired, its gameplay provided really nothing new, and the shift away from the original's dark, nostalgic take on Disney's forgotten characters in favor of a lighter, more generic tone alienated a lot of people. But whether it was truly a bad game or not, what's undeniable is its status as a flop, selling way below Disney's expectations and even resulting directly in the closure of developer Junction Point Studios. Defiance, developed and published by Trion Worlds, was an ambitious third-person shooter MMO designed as a transmedia tie-in to the sci-fi TV series of the same name, with shared storylines and events. It was a tremendously exciting prospect for a game, and hype before launch was off the charts. But when the launch did come, players immediately experienced severe bugs, glitches, and connectivity problems. Common complaints included quest-breaking bugs like missions that couldn't be completed without restarting, server crashes, lag during multiplayer events, and persistent issues like characters not loading properly. Not all of these issues were ever even fixed at all, but if you could get past them, you still had a fairly lackluster experience to contend with, featuring low draw distances made worse by a weird beige fog, a weirdly empty feeling world, and monotonous quests. As a transmedia project, Defiance promised deep ties to the sci-fi series via things like shared events affecting both. But in reality, the connections were superficial, mostly throwaway lines or minor updates like destroyed landmarks. Worse yet, the TV show itself was mediocre and ended up cancelled after only 3 seasons in 2015, dragging the game's relevance down even further. Players who didn't watch the show felt lost, while fans found the crossover gimmicky and underdeveloped, missing out on all the promise once held for immersive storytelling. The game undersold launch expectations considering its massive $70 million budget and never really recovered, though it did chug along until 2021 when all servers officially closed. Square Enix is a storied company with a long history of success, especially when it comes to their 2 most prominent RPG franchises, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. So when Final Fantasy XIV was released, expectations were very high as usual. Secure in the knowledge that they could essentially do no wrong, the studio went in a bold and interesting new direction, making the 14th mainline entry in the series an MMORPG to try to snag a piece of the multi-billion-dollar action that World of Warcraft had been dominating for half a decade. Just one problem though, apparently the studio could do wrong, and did do wrong with this one in a number of ways. When the game came out, it was criticized by both reviewers and players as unintuitive, clunky, unbalanced, and severely lacking in content and depth. There were also issues with performance and numerous bugs and glitches, made worse if you weren't playing on an unreasonably high-end PC. This last point was a pretty significant issue, especially back in 2010 when expectations for new releases, even AAA ones, were quite a bit different from today. Final Fantasy XIV really didn't appeal to anyone. It was lacking standard MMO features like robust social systems and engaging group content, but neither was it particularly appealing to fans of the single-player entries in the franchise. The game was so bad it was shut down within 2 years and completely replaced by what amounted to an almost entirely new game, Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. Thinking back, replacement director Naoki Yoshida remarked in a 2025 interview, "The goal was about restoring customer trust. I did not set any business goals. For us, this meant every single person, players, fans, distribution partners, and the media." And to his credit, A Realm Reborn did regain some of the trust lost by the original Final Fantasy XIV. It's hard to overstate how big the harmonics-created rhythm games of the 2000s were. To this day, go to a garage sale anywhere in suburban North America and you're likely as not to see a bin full of plastic guitars or drum sets belonging to the giant franchises Guitar Hero or Rock Band. But these games were often criticized by some serious musicians and aspiring learners for being too different from the actual instruments to be transferable to the real thing. You couldn't become the next Jimi Hendrix no matter how many thousands of hours you put into slapping buttons on the simplified replicas, said naysayers. Enter 745 Studios, a subsidiary of First Act, a bona fide musical instrument manufacturer based in Boston. 745 figured they had the secret to challenging the dominance of harmonics. A game with a peripheral that wasn't just a video game controller cleverly disguised as a replica of an electric guitar, but was instead a real actual guitar that you could use for the game or even play as a standalone instrument. Boldly debuting just 1 week before the release of Rock Band 3, Power Gig: Rise of the Sixth String was aiming to revolutionize the genre. Instead, it ended up completely flopping, leading to the closure of the studio within a couple years. While Power Gig did have a few things going for it, like the inclusion of songs from artists like Eric Clapton, who had previously criticized Guitar Hero for its simplified interpretation, what it ultimately failed to deliver was an actual enjoyable gameplay experience. The game was criticized for a boring and limited soundtrack overall, and the visuals and story were ugly and dated. Worst of all, the guitar itself was hard to fret, requiring 5 times the force of a standard guitar, and it was prone to false inputs, heavy, and awkwardly scaled. It sounded cheap as a standalone guitar and didn't even really succeed in teaching the basics to new players, meaning it effectively failed on all fronts. The Postal franchise, created by Running with Scissors, is a series of high-speed shooter games infamous for its violence and off-color humor. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but it does enjoy a somewhat dedicated cult fan base and even inspired a 2007 comedy film, which incidentally was a complete disaster that flopped at the box office, grossing less than 1% of its budget. Nevertheless, hopes were high a few years later for Postal III, which Running with Scissors had outsourced the development of to Russian studio Akela. The company's VP of Development, John Merchant, later recalled, "Akela had vastly more resources than we had for Postal 2, so it seemed reasonable at the time that they could produce a game that was at least equal to the game we made in-house. Things started out well, but I think they got hit pretty hard by the economic problems of 2007-8, and it all started to go downhill from there. The final product was very far removed from our original design and horribly broken." Postal 3 was notoriously buggy, crashing frequently with frame rate drops, endless loading times, and compatibility issues on certain PC builds. Hitboxes for both melee and shooting were janky, and attacks, and especially headshots, rarely registered correctly. And the AI was completely broken, with the escort missions that dominated gameplay proving frustrating and borderline unplayable. The franchise's controversial humor also fell flat in this entry, even for people who enjoyed the shock value of previous games. This time around, the jokes just felt outdated and sad, offensive and edgy for the sake of it, with no real cleverness. Postal 3 flopped so hard that Running with Scissors pulled it from their store and officially retconned it as a non-canon entry. As for Akela, they went bankrupt and ceased operations the following year. Fallout 3, widely regarded as one of the worst video games of all time, is an action racing game featuring an impressive 9 game modes ranging from standard races to a battle arena and even a monster truck mode. Unfortunately, none of these modes ended up being worth playing. The visuals were outdated even for 2011, featuring low-resolution textures, horrendous motion blur, overexposed lighting, low polygon models, and excessive bloom effects that made tracks look like they were covered in Vaseline. Buildings appeared as flat 2D sprites, and the overall aesthetic was described as ugly and low budget compared to predecessors. The game's core destruction racing mechanics, a hallmark of the series, were broken. Cars felt floaty and too light, with unrealistic weight shifts causing them to fly off uncontrollably from minor collisions. Physics were janky and inconsistent, and AI behavior was erratic and unpredictable, and I don't mean in a good way. Mostly the game was just boring though, with bland, repetitive tracks and a complete lack of any kind of career mode or progression system like Fallout 2 had. The game was announced in early December 2011 and released just a week later on December 13th, leaving effectively zero time for meaningful marketing, polishing, or community building. This quiet release by publisher Strategy First was seen as a cash grab attempt to exploit the IP after previous publisher Empire Interactive's bankruptcy transferred the ownership to them. The franchise did recover somewhat 6 years later with Fallout 4, but the reputational damage from the third game proved too great for a successful revival. Other games may have offered less content for more money, or come up shorter in specific individual areas, but I don't think there's ever been a game that does so many things so universally poorly. These are the words of EGM's Josh Harmon in what turned out to be a fairly representative review of Ride to Hell Retribution, a third-person action-adventure game featuring biker Jake Conway as he seeks revenge for the death of his brother. Originally announced in 2008 as an ambitious open-world biker game, it was finally rushed out 5 years later as a linear mess after developers realized they lacked the skills to deliver as promised and ended up stripping features. Though in a rather embarrassing twist, they left loading screen tips referencing non-existent elements that they had cut, like one that says killing civilians can draw unwanted attention, something that never happens in the game. Amateurish visuals featured a drab brown color scheme, inconsistent texture pop-in, and poor facial animations. The revenge plot was predictable and poorly paced, with unnecessary twists and all. And the dialogue, listen, I'm no shrinking violet. I get why this kind of thing can be entertaining in the right context, but damn, there are some lines in this game that I definitely can't repeat on YouTube and probably wouldn't want to anyway for fear of either my mother disowning me or just dying of cringe. The gameplay was no better, lacking variety and including many major game-breaking bugs. The core loop of combat, driving, and shooting was universally panned as clunky, outdated, and lacking depth, with fist-fighting reduced to button mashing or spamming kicks, ineffective cover systems, and tedious bullet sponge enemies. After a 30-year run in the industry and dozens of titles, developer Eutechnix would release only a handful of games following Ride to Hell before shutting down completely. Fighter Within, a fighting game published by Ubisoft and the sequel to 2010's poorly received Fighters Uncaged, was one of a handful of Xbox One exclusive launch titles to release in 2013. Like its predecessor, Fighter Within was designed for use with Microsoft's Kinect motion controls. Unfortunately, these games were not the best showcase of the tech. In fact, the game's reliance on Kinect for motion controls led to constant frustration as it frequently failed to detect basic punches, kicks, blocks, or combos accurately, even in ideal conditions. Complex moves like throws or specials felt like luck rather than skill, with noticeable input delays exacerbating the issue. Menus were equally finicky, often misreading swipes or gestures. If you could get past all this, you quickly realized that the bland, uninspired take on the genre essentially equated to a motion-based version of button mashing, with all characters sharing identical styles and movesets. AI opponents were often too easy, allowing quick progression but highlighting the game's emptiness, and then when difficulty did spike, it stemmed from control issues rather than smart AI. Compounding the issues, the game's heavy promotion as a Kinect showcase amplified backlash against Microsoft's initial Kinect mandatory bundles and higher console price, which alienated gamers who preferred traditional controllers and contributed to low adoption of the system itself compared to Nintendo and Sony rivals. The sixth entry in the long-running Alone in the Dark series, Illumination, is a third-person shooter game with minor horror elements. And when I say minor, I really mean it. The survival horror gameplay elements fans had become accustomed to in earlier games in the series, with tension-building pacing and exploration-focused gameplay, were replaced with pretty generic co-op third-person shooting. The constant monster harassment without build-up meant that the horror never subsides, undermining anticipation, while the absence of decisive action due to general slowness of enemies actually left it feeling neither scary nor thrilling. Critics lamented it as an abomination that forgot to be a horror at all, tarnishing the franchise's legacy and disappointing fans expecting the franchise's signature cosmic dread. All of this might have been forgiven if the game succeeded as a fun co-op shooter a la Left 4 Dead 2, but the stagnant and unengaging sessions completely missed the mark. There were essentially zero innovations here, and where the game did try to weave in interesting mechanics like the light vulnerability system for monsters, these features felt contrived and broken, as enemies would just lurk outside the light sources annoyingly, infinite respawns prevented area clearing, and players could often simply jog past threats. The franchise was sold off to publisher THQ Nordic later in the decade, who attempted a reboot in 2024. This reimagining of the original was unfortunately yet another disappointment, leading to the closure of developer Pieces Interactive and quite possibly ending the series forever. 2014 was a bad year for our spiky blue hedgehog friend Sonic. Long gone were the heyday of Sega's mascot at the very top of the pile, even beating out Nintendo's Mario in sales in some years in the 90s. Instead, what we got here was a broken game with frequent crashes, frame rate drops, environmental clipping, missing sound effects, and game-breaking glitches that made Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric frustrating and unplayable for many players. Critics lambasted the unresponsive controls, awkward camera system, tedious and repetitive combat, overly linear levels, and low difficulty, which failed to deliver the fast-paced, exhilarating experience expected from Sonic games. The shift to a more adventure-style format with puzzle elements felt uninspired and mismatched for the series, worsened by a narrative that was criticized as poorly written with repetitive character quips, forced humor including outdated meme references, constant unnecessary dialogue interrupting gameplay, and shallow character arcs that just didn't resonate. This was exacerbated by last-minute changes to align with the TV show's canon and toy line, diluting the story's coherence in an attempt to build up a multimedia franchise in the modern era. Due to an exclusivity deal with Nintendo, Sega was forced to accommodate the Wii U's limitations and its low install base. We're not sure how good this game could have been if it weren't for that, but given the sister title Shattered Crystal released at the same time on the far more popular 3DS and ended up flopping even harder than this one, we're inclined not to offer the benefit of the doubt in this case. Sega producer Stephen Frost said in an interview, "The biggest mistake in Boom was trying to cram too much into the game. Not only were we trying to make just a really good Sonic game, we were trying to add more to it. If there's any lesson for me, it's that being too ambitious can be bad." In the mid-2010s, the long-running and popular Tony Hawk Pro Skater franchise, published by Activision since way back in the 90s, was set to come to an end. The franchising deal with the famous professional skateboarder was coming to an end in 2015 to be precise, so Activision was eager to cash out while they still could. Problem was, this meant designing, developing, and promoting Tony Hawk Pro Skater 5 in just a few months. A monumental undertaking with predictable results. The game was riddled with game-breaking bugs, including skaters disappearing into the ground, cartwheeling uncontrollably through the air, frequent crashes, janky collision detection, and physics that didn't mesh with the gameplay. Textures often loaded late, or not at all. Frame rates were awful and camera angles were busted. Most stages were empty, lifeless, and lacked flow, with bad layouts that didn't encourage smooth combos or exploration. Some of the revamped classic levels, which were supposed to appeal to the nostalgia of longtime fans, were the most disappointing, like School 3, which was simultaneously too similar to the classic School 2 and also somehow far worse, with basically every minor change widely considered to be detrimental. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 5 would wind up being the final game developed by studio Robomoto as they'd go bankrupt the following year. Umbrella Corps, a multiplayer-focused third-person shooter set in the Resident Evil universe, was released to celebrate the franchise's 20th anniversary, but instead became one of its most reviled entries. It received dismal reviews and poor sales, leading to a pretty quick near abandonment by Capcom. Frequent bugs, stuttering frame rates, and murky, low-quality textures made the game an unsightly, stumbling mess, especially on consoles. The maps were fussy and poorly designed, worsening hit detection and visibility problems, while the narrow third-person camera view, which some said felt like being glued to the soldier's ear, offered limited situational awareness, resulting in frequent unheralded deaths. The game felt like a cash-in of Resident Evil. Despite the universe tie-in, it lacked horror elements, personality, or lore integration. Zombies were mere nuisances rather than threats, characters were generic, and it pulled nothing meaningful from the series beyond some recognizable settings, though these were often even mangled. Capcom quietly delayed the release from May to June of 2016 with little marketing, positioning it as an unasked-for experiment that no one anticipated or wanted, especially amid the hype for Resident Evil 7's return to roots, which ended up being a far more successful direction for the company. Fallout 76 was Bethesda's first ever multiplayer game and served as a prequel of sorts to previous entries in the Fallout series. Unfortunately, severe bugs, glitches, performance issues, and technical problems at launch, including lag, unstable frame rates, stiff animations, poor collision detection, unresponsive controls, and frequent crashes, plagued the game and frustrated players right from the start. The studio's lack of experience in multiplayer was pretty obvious, as unstable servers led to random disconnects, crashes were caused by certain player actions like nukes, and overall the online infrastructure was criticized as unreliable or even downright inaccessible sometimes. The story is unengaging, and the world feels lifeless and barren, lacking the depth and immersion of previous entries in the series. The shift to an always online multiplayer format further alienated longtime fans who enjoyed Bethesda's classic single-player titles. Worst of all were the many controversies surrounding the game's marketing. The most hilariously bad example is Fallout 76's Power Armor Special Edition, marketed as coming with a cool duffel bag made of canvas. Instead, what was shipped ended up being a cheap nylon bag. After many complaints, Bethesda's response was to offer $5 in the in-game Atom currency, a paltry amount that, funny enough, wasn't even enough to purchase the in-game canvas bag which came with the postman uniform. Adding salt to the wound, certain online influencers were given canvas bags for free to help promote the game. Bethesda did eventually try to make things right, producing new canvas bags for all owners of the Power Armor Edition. But the troubles weren't over yet, as a data breach leaked the personal information on dozens of affected players that had submitted support tickets to receive the new bag. The whole fiasco has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of pre-ordering, even from a studio with a solid reputation or a series you love. Based on the comic book series, distinct from the TV show, and indeed it was marketed as willing to explore adult themes differently from the show, 2018's The Walking Dead was developed by Overkill Software, the studio famous for its Payday series. Like Payday, The Walking Dead is a first-person shooter with a strong emphasis on co-op gameplay. In fact, the game features a lot of similarities to Payday, perhaps too many, as one of the main criticisms of the game was its complete lack of any kind of innovation, instead delivering what amounted to Payday with zombies. The Walking Dead IP was seen as a thin excuse for missions, delivered via short CGI cutscenes with no real player investment in characters or the camp, leaving the game feeling hollow. It also suffered from bugs, poor balance, janky animations, and unsmooth controls, leaving players with a feeling that the game lacked refinement. These issues were largely caused by a late-in-the-game switch from the unusable in-house Valhalla engine to Unreal 4, forcing a near-total rebuild in just 18 months, with most of the team unfamiliar with the new engine, resulting in what developers later equated to a beta game that couldn't be adequately polished on time. Extinction is an action game developed by fairly unknown developer Iron Galaxy, a studio whose experience is mainly in developing ports of other games. In the game, you play as one of the world's last sentinels, a soldier named Avil, equipped with the skills to battle the endless wave of Raveni. You fight massive brutes and their minions across a sprawling countryside, defending cities and rescuing refugees torn from their homes. The game's launch was met with scathing reviews across outlets, branding it as one of 2018's worst titles due mainly to its unfulfilled potential. Core missions boiled down to endless procedurally generated escort quests with zero variety. Levels reused environments up to 33 times, and objectives felt like replaying the same level repeatedly. This monotony killed the engagement after the first hour of play, failing to build on inspiration from earlier similar games like Shadow of the Colossus or Attack on Titan. The narrative was delivered via static dialogues and low-effort cartoons, featuring cliché characters, spammy voice acting, and no antagonist depth, leading players to skip the content pretty much mostly entirely. All of this might have been forgiven for a budget game, but given the price tag of around $40, pushing it dangerously close to AAA territory at the time, Extinction was considered kinda a ripoff. The final game in the Just Cause series, developed by Avalanche Studios and published by Square Enix, came out in 2018 and was met with heavy criticism for numerous bugs, glitches, and stability issues, repetitive and poorly designed missions, a weak story, a lack of depth, and worsely, the removal of key features and mechanics from previous games, such as grenades, C4 explosives, unlimited ammo, pistols, destruction-based liberation of bases and towns, wingsuit challenges, and the ability to create forward operating bases. This all made the game feel dumbed down and less engaging for fans than previous entries. There were even severe graphical and technical regressions compared to Just Cause 3, which led to widespread player disappointment and required post-launch patches to partially address them. To Square's credit, they did commit to fixing things, and by April of 2019, many of the complaints had been alleviated, but this came too late to save the game, and ultimately, as it turned out, the series, at least for now, since the publisher's president Yosuke Matsuda singled out Just Cause 4 as the main contributor to Square Enix posting a 1.7 billion yen loss in its HD Games subsegment in their Q3 earnings report for that year. Some of you might be surprised to see BioWare's Anthem on this list, given that the game did sell well over 5 million copies. An impressive haul under some circumstances, but not nearly enough for a massive AAA title whose development spanned nearly 7 years, but suffered from constant indecision, reboots, and a lack of unified direction from leadership. All this meant that despite the enormous costs, core elements like gameplay loops, story, and missions were hastily assembled, resulting in an incomplete product on launch. BioWare's single-player RPG background clashed with EA's demands for a multiplayer looter-shooter, and so leadership lacked expertise in areas like long-term economies, endgame content, and player-driven narratives, leading to flawed systems that couldn't sustain engagement. Also, EA's mandated use of the Frostbite engine, which was ill-suited for RPGs and multiplayer features, created massive hurdles like long loading times, bugs, and the need to rebuild tools, forcing cuts to ambitious ideas and slowing the progress of development dramatically. Anthem is a good example of a case where monetization priorities and publisher intervention can turn what might have otherwise been a smash hit into a mediocre flop. WWE 2K20 carried on the long tradition of at least one WWE game release every single year since 2000, and all of these games, printing money for publishers THQ and then later on 2K, had one thing in common. They were developed by Osaka-based studio U.S.E. 2K20 was the first, therefore, to switch lead developers to Visual Concepts, a sister company to 2K under the Take-Two umbrella, who had only contributed supporting development to U.S.E. on previous games in the series. This followed the discovery that U.S.E. was working on a rival wrestling IP after they'd publicly expressed frustration over their relationship with 2K. The departure of U.S.E. proved a disaster for WWE 2K20, which launched in a broken state with rampant technical issues including distorted character models, freezing during matches, invisible wrestlers, and frequent crashes. This made core gameplay unplayable for many, leading to immediate backlash and even a social media trend calling on 2K to hashtag fix WWE 2K20. The most humorous issue had to be a notorious glitch which caused the game to crash entirely when the system clocks rolled over to New Year's Day of 2020, affecting modes like Create a Superstar and preventing play until players manually rolled back their console dates or waited for a patch. The infamous Y2K20 bug amplified perceptions of incompetence and became a meme-worthy symbol of the game's failures. After all this, 2020 and 21 became the first years in the new millennium not to receive a mainline WWE game, though the series did get back on track in 2022 and has continued strong to this day. The 2014 Godzilla game, developed by Natsumi Atari and published by Bandai Namco, was a critical and commercial disappointment, earning low critic scores and poor sales, especially outside Japan. Complaints centered around how the game's structure forces players into near-identical objectives across dozens of stages, essentially just destroy buildings, fight waves of enemies, and repeat, with minimal innovation or progression in gameplay loops. This core monotony turned off players quickly, as even short sessions felt like grinding without any real payoff. Combat and movement feels lumbering and unresponsive, with clunky mechanics that made precise actions like dodging or targeting unreliable. This turned what should have been epic kaiju battles into frustrating slogs, especially on PS4 where expectations for smooth controls were higher than other places. The initial disappointing sales in Japan spelled almost certain doom for the global release. 6 months later, this doom was realized as Western players, many of whom were expecting an arcade-style fighter like Destroy All Monsters Melee, were confused and disappointed by the Japanese arcade-inspired sim game roots of Godzilla. While the game ended up being a big flop on launch, it has developed a small cult following among Godzilla fans in recent years who have found something uniquely faithful to the character and the franchise, despite the game's flaws. Like many others on this list, Crackdown 3 suffered from significant challenges and delays, originally announced in 2014 for a 2016 release, but not actually coming out until much later in 2019. This led to a product that felt rushed yet outdated, unable to meet evolving industry standards and suffering from waning interest over time. The action-adventure game, set 10 years after the events of Crackdown 2, ironically now releasing nearly 10 years after that game, received middling reviews from critics, but was received even more poorly by gamers themselves, who felt that publisher Microsoft had failed to deliver on the hype they generated for the game. For example, Microsoft heavily promoted revolutionary cloud computing for fully destructible environments, with early demos showing buildings collapsing in great detail. However, this was downgraded significantly and limited to the multiplayer mode, leading to widespread disappointment and even accusations of false advertising. Another example was actor Terry Crews, who was heavily featured in promotions as the face of the game, but in actuality only appeared briefly in the intro and as a selectable skin, furthering the sense of a bait and switch by Microsoft. The visuals resembled an upscaled older game rather than a current-gen title, lacking the polish of contemporaries like Red Dead Redemption 2. Issues like inconsistent performance and uninspired art direction also made Crackdown 3 feel more like a relic of the mid-2010s than one on the cusp of the next decade. The plot involved a generic evil megacorporation with underdeveloped characters, minimal cutscenes, and no meaningful progression or motivations, making it hard to get invested in the world as well. Talking about the many delays that had caused so many of these problems, Xbox head Phil Spencer expressed before the game released, "The last delay was down to me not feeling it felt quite right. I want Crackdown to become an important Xbox franchise." As of 2025, Spencer's hopes do not seem to have been realized. If you've watched our video on flops of the 1990s, you probably remember the unique and innovative claymation game The Neverhood that failed commercially but garnered a fairly large cult following over the coming decades. The retrospective attention the game was getting encouraged the original team, who'd previously worked together on Earthworm Jim, to get together once more and give it another try. And so a Kickstarter campaign resulted in a $975,000 starting budget, a success that encouraged the team, who founded a new development company called Pencil Test Studios and got to work on R.U.S.E. Unfortunately, the budget turned out to be insufficient, according to designer Doug Nukem, who said in an interview a couple years later, "R.U.S.E. was a great opportunity that got about 90% there. Sadly enough though, we ran out of resources to put the polish on it." So those final 10% is a lot of where the smoothness and stability of a game comes from, and the bottom line is we were stretched too far with too little resources. Every dime and then some went into that game. It's difficult when it doesn't work out as well as we wanted. I've played it with my kids and there is a lot of fun to it. Among the primary complaints over R.U.S.E. are its short length, weak story, disappointing puzzles, and the many severe technical bugs and glitches which tanked review scores and destroyed word of mouth on platforms like Steam. But even if it was a perfect game, there's a good chance that R.U.S.E. would have always struggled to gain mainstream appeal due to its niche point-and-click genre and unique art style. Which brings me to our next category. Not every game that flopped in the 2010s was necessarily a bad game. Some studios boldly develop games that push the boundaries or aren't afraid to be a little bit different. Whether artsy passion projects, esoteric story-driven epics, or pioneers of innovative and unconventional genres, here are some games that just couldn't break out into mainstream success. Rhythm Thief and the Emperor's Treasure is a delightful rhythm puzzle adventure game developed by Sega for the Nintendo 3DS, blending infectious musical challenges with a charming story set in the romantic streets of Paris. Players step into the shoes of Raphael, a suave young art thief known as Phantom R, who embarks on a thrilling quest to uncover the mystery of his father's disappearance 3 years prior. What makes Rhythm Thief unique is its seamless fusion of exploration and puzzle solving in the style of the Professor Layton series with high-energy rhythm-based gameplay. Everyday actions like sneaking past guards, dancing in street battles, or fencing with foes transform into exhilarating minigames synced to catchy, upbeat tracks that demand precise timing and flair. The 3DS's stereoscopic visuals bring Paris to life with vibrant animations and stylish flair, while the soundtrack's jazzy, pop-infused beats keep players hooked. Unfortunately, because of its niche genre, largely past its prime by 2012, Sega had low confidence in the appeal of the game for broad audiences. In a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, this led to minimal marketing effort that meant a widespread lack of awareness of the game, which struggled to stand out in a crowded 3DS library. The final nail in the coffin for Rhythm Thief was the release of Theater Rhythm Final Fantasy at almost exactly the same time, which offered superior content and music licensing and replayability, cannibalizing the niche market. Though with only a few 100,000 copies sold, many consider even that game to be something of a hidden gem. Fusion Genesis is an ambitious Xbox 360 arcade title that brilliantly blends twin-stick shooter action with RPG elements and MMO aspirations in a vast, persistent online space universe. Set in a futuristic galaxy teeming with intrigue, the story kicks off with you as a humble lab assistant whose mentor is assassinated, thrusting you into possession of a rickety ship and a loyal sentient AI companion. Gameplay shines with addictive twin-stick controls for seamless ship maneuvering and combat, where you blast foes, mine asteroids for upgrades, trade cargo, and tackle missions ranging from smuggling runs to epic dogfights. You can level up your customizable sentient to act as a tank, healer, or buffer, and even auction them online for a clever economy twist. But when Fusion Genesis released, it came and went almost entirely unnoticed. Developed by Starfire Studios, which had been founded by 4 former Rare employees, the game suffered from a lack of appeal, partly driven by its ambitious mashup of shooting, exploration, trading, and faction-based multiplayer, which was seen as complicated and intimidating for casual gamers. Reviewers and users criticized its steep learning curve, unexplained systems, cluttered interface, and lack of accessibility, alienating potential buyers looking for a quick, approachable Xbox Live Arcade experience. And as a $15 digital title dependent on online multiplayer for its full potential, low initial sales created a vicious cycle. Sparse servers led to empty lobbies, discouraging further purchases and reviews. By 2013, with Xbox 360's lifecycle advancing and no updates or sequels, momentum was lost entirely. Puyo Puyo Chronicle is a captivating puzzle RPG hybrid released in 2016 for the 3DS, brilliantly commemorating the series' 25th anniversary with innovative twists that set it apart from traditional entries, including the franchise's first ever use of fully 3D character models and explorable environments instead of 2D portraits, creating a vibrant, immersive world. With over 60 side quests, DLC dungeons, and nostalgic music remixes, it's a fresh, joyous evolution that keeps players hooked for hours. At least for those that were willing to give it a shot. Puyo Puyo Chronicle ended up selling an abysmal 21,000 total units over its lifetime. Launch timing had something to do with it, with the game coming out at the very tail end of the 3DS lifecycle and the Switch sucking a lot of the air out of the room, but the real culprit is the series' lack of recognition globally. When you're trying to expand your IP into a brand new genre, you're often relying on a lot of name recognition and a connection with characters and settings that's been cultivated over time. But for Puyo Puyo, that connection didn't really exist, especially outside of Japan. In fact, the most successful Puyo Puyo games, like 1995's cozy title Super Puyo Puyo, were rebranded for release in the West, with Super getting a reskin as Kirby's Avalanche. So when Sega took a risk and brought in RPG elements to this long-standing series, traditionalist fans in Japan balked, and the company had nowhere else to market the game. Rebooting the acclaimed parkour adventure game Mirror's Edge from 8 years earlier, Mirror's Edge Catalyst has players step into the agile boots of Faith Connors, a fearless runner in the gleaming dystopian metropolis of Glass, ruled by the oppressive conglomerate. This first-person platformer transforms movement into an art form with fluid mechanics like wall running, sliding, ziplining, and leaping across rooftops, creating an unparalleled sense of momentum and immersion that very few games replicate. Its minimalist aesthetic, dominated by pristine whites with vibrant red accents for navigation cues, not only aids gameplay but evokes a stylish, futuristic atmosphere that's visually stunning and thematically resonant. Following the cult success of the first Mirror's Edge, publisher EA was surprised at the lack of enthusiasm for a sequel. But ironically, a bigger budget this time around led to decisions like an expanded format and an open world, which ultimately just pushed the game into an even more niche category instead of building on what made the original stand out in a more widely appealing way. Following the original announcement of U-Draw Studio, an art game for the Wii that came bundled with its own drawing tablet, analysts estimated that it would sell up to 1 million units through the 2010 holiday season. Aiming to recapture some of the magic of Mario Paint from 18 years earlier, developers Pipeworks Software were hoping that creative amateurs intimidated or priced out of higher-end graphics rigs would find U-Draw an appealing entry point. And as it turned out, the analysts were right. U-Draw was seen as a perfect companion for the Wii console and surpassed expectations. THQ, the publisher of the U-Draw, got excited. A little too excited. In an act of sheer unbridled hubris, they prematurely scaled production and released versions for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in 2011, assuming that naturally they'd see similar demand on each of these platforms. The HD console versions were a disaster, with sales far below expectations, resulting in 1.4 million unsold units and a $100 million revenue shortfall. This overproduction and market misread was cited by THQ's CFO as the primary cause of financial woes of the company, directly accelerating their bankruptcy. The biggest problem here was the way the U-Draw targeted a kids and casuals market too narrowly, which alienated the more hardcore enthusiast gamers on the Xbox and PlayStation platforms. The product philosophy emphasized the simplicity of the art tools, but this became the main factor in the game failing to catch on with audiences other than those on the family-friendly Wii. R.U.S e follows Major Joseph Sheridan, a sharp-witted Harvard dropout turned U.S. military officer, as he climbs the ranks from the North African deserts in 1943 to the heart of Europe in 1945. Sheridan's journey involves pivotal World War II battles like Kasserine Pass, Monte Cassino, D-Day, Operation Market Garden, and the Battle of the Bulge, uncovering espionage twists including a double-agent plot tied to nuclear-armed V-2 rockets. The Ubisoft-published RTS allowed players to deploy psychological tactics like decoy units, radio silence to conceal forces, camouflage, spies for intel, or blitz orders for aggressive pushes, elevating gameplay beyond mere resource gathering and unit spam to a chess-like game of complex misdirection and mind games. But it was this complexity that would ultimately be R.U.S.'s downfall, with many considering the game too inaccessible or complicated for beginners, especially compared to StarCraft II, which released, get this, less than 2 months earlier. In no world could any RTS have possibly succeeded so close to StarCraft II's release, but a complex, slower-paced, more cerebral take on the genre and the already saturated World War II setting stood even less of a chance than most. Many fans felt the game never got the attention it deserved, made all the worse in 2015 when it was suddenly pulled from the Steam store and even had its own website deleted by Ubisoft. An employee of developer Eugen Systems commented, "As far as we are concerned, I couldn't get any reason for what happened. My boss even learned about it from me, and unfortunately all of the people I knew at Ubisoft back then are gone." The Ubi producer working with us for R.U.S. was Mathieu Girard, whom since then has created his own studio. For their part, Ubisoft blamed the expiration of licensing rights over certain military items for the sudden disappearance of the game. Alpha Protocol, an action RPG developed by Obsidian, the same studio behind Knights of the Old Republic 2, Fallout New Vegas, and South Park: The Stick of Truth, among many other classic games, brilliantly captures the thrill of being a secret agent in a high-stakes world of intrigue while fusing third-person shooting, stealth mechanics, and deep RPG progression, letting you tailor the protagonist's expertise in martial arts, gadgets, hacking, or persuasion for personalized playstyles. Another thing that sets the game apart is its innovative dialogue wheel, timed for tension and styled after attitudes like suave, aggressive, or professional, which authentically influence relationships without simplistic morality systems. A number of missteps contributed to the failure of Alpha Protocol commercially, such as lackluster marketing and support from publisher Sega, especially after initial sales didn't meet expectations. But mostly, the game found a tough time finding an audience for its unique choice-driven, dialogue-heavy progression compared to the more action-focused entries popular in the genre at the time. In 2017, when asked which game of all of those in the long history of Obsidian that CEO Fergus Urquhart would like to go back to, he said, "I think I'd want to do Alpha Protocol 2, particularly now that it's almost like the game has sort of, I don't want to say aged because I mean it in a positive sense. It's found what people love about it and what we love about it. And now I think we could express it differently, fixing a lot of the things that weren't maybe what they should have been." Quick, name another game just like Portal. You probably can't, can you? But Portal was a massive success, so you'd think there'd be plenty of copycats and clones hoping to cash in on Valve's success. And there were those that tried, but the problem is when you scrape away the polish and prestige of Valve's development resources, you're left in the end with what's ultimately a pretty niche genre, the puzzle platformer. But if anyone could succeed where Valve had, it was arguably Square Enix, who had signed on as publisher of airtight games Quantum Conundrum. For they had a secret weapon. Kim Swift, none other than the lead designer of Portal itself, had signed on to the project. As an obvious spiritual successor to Portal, with clever dimension-shifting puzzles and a quirky story of its own, Quantum Conundrum received generally positive reviews. But Swift was clear that they were trying to differentiate this game from Portal, saying in an interview, "The game controls are completely different. You're not controlling portals, you're controlling the entire environments, and you're given the ability to change different dimensions on the fly. Each one of the dimensions you gain access to in the game become another tool in your arsenal for solving different puzzles and challenges. The sense of humor is different, and I'm gonna say completely different, a little more lighthearted, a little quirkier, and a little more offbeat. And the art style is far and away completely different. We have a more cartoony, stylized atmosphere that we decided on based on the fact that the gameplay itself is very quirky. We saw that having something more stylized would lend itself better to the gameplay. But gamers weren't convinced, and as it turned out, there really wasn't much space in the genre for two games as similar as Quantum Conundrum and Portal. This despite the quirkiness and offbeat colorful cartooniness, especially with the release of Portal II a year earlier. When Killer is Dead came out in 2013, writer Goichi Suda's legendary eccentricity shone through, proving tremendously pleasing to cult fans of his earlier titles like Killer 7 or No More Heroes, but lacked a clear hook for mass audiences. Without relatable characters or innovative multiplayer, it struggled against the year's heavy hitters like Grand Theft Auto V and The Last of Us. For his part, Suda repeatedly blamed inconsistent publisher strategies for developer Grasshopper's sales woes, noting that despite the studio's mid-tier status, it was often treated like an indie developer with minimal promotional backing. While we're inclined to agree that a little bit more publisher support might have made a difference, there's no denying that their signature cel-shaded visuals and unique atmospheres had to have contributed at least a little bit to Grasshopper's status as a bit of a niche player. In Killer is Dead, gameplay excels in fluid hack-and-slash combat, where building combo meters unlocks devastating moves. Protagonist Mondo's katana slices foes, while his arm morphs into guns for rapid-fire, freezing, or charged blasts. Perfect dodges trigger adrenaline rush for slow-mo executions, making skill and strategy success feel rewarding. Quirky gigolo missions involve charming women to earn upgrades, injecting humorous, flirtatious variety for some. Of course, others felt that these were wildly offensive, particularly reviewers in the Western gaming press, some of whom slammed the game for what they labeled as misogyny. Like many of Suda51's games, Killer is Dead proved a cult hit over time, so while the game didn't enjoy immediate commercial success, its fanbase has only grown since then. Puppeteer is a delightfully inventive side-scrolling platformer developed by Japan Studios that stands out even over a decade later as an underrated gem in the genre. Its story unfolds like a whimsical yet dark fairy tale. Young boy Karuto is abducted by the tyrannical Moon Bear King, transported to a lunar castle, transformed into a wooden puppet, and decapitated. Undeterred, Kotaro discovers the magical scissors Calabrus, teams up with the sassy fairy Picarina and the mischievous cat Yin Yang, and embarks on a quest to defeat the king's 12 generals, reclaim stolen moon goddess soul fragments, and find his way home. Fluid gameplay mechanics mesh with creative environmental interactions, such as snipping through fabric landscapes or gliding on paper elements, with optional co-op letting a second player control Picarina for spotlight searches and assists. The most obvious standout feature is Puppeteer's theatrical puppet show presentation. The entire adventure plays out on a dynamic stage with a lively narrator, cheering or booing audience, real-time set changes, and vibrant handcrafted visuals that blend humor, horror, and heart. Its enchanting art direction, orchestral score, and inventive level design, spanning 7 acts like Pirate Seas and Haunted Forests, create an immersive storybook experience that's endlessly charming and replayable. But the charming visuals and family-friendly tone failed to capture enough of the 3D platformer pie, in an era of already waning popularity for that genre compared to the ascendancy of open-world blockbusters. In 2013's adventure puzzle game Rain, a young boy confined to a bed with a fever spots an invisible girl outside his window, visible only when rain falls upon her. Intrigued, he ventures into a nocturnal, abandoned town inspired by mid-20th century Paris, where he too becomes invisible except under the rain. Together, the silent protagonists evade monstrous creatures like the menacing unknown, navigating puzzles and perils in a floating castle maze, ultimately discovering their visible doppelgangers in the real world. Gameplay revolves around innovative stealth mechanics. Characters and enemies are only discernible in the rain, turning shelters into hiding spots tracked by watery footprints, emphasizing evasion over the combat-based gameplay common in more popular adventure games. But it's the profundity, chilling atmosphere, and emotional depth that make Rain an enduring memory for those who have played through its concise few hours. But the game's artsy, melancholic tone was just too great a departure from mainstream action-adventure tropes, which limited its audience to a small subset of players that are interested in atmospheric walking simulators, rather than gaining broad appeal. But for all appearances, that seems to suit the artisans at Japanese developer Acquire just fine. Calling Prey Prey, that was very, very hurtful to me. I did not want to call this game Prey, and I had to say I wanted to anyway in front of journalists. There is a bit of the artistic, the creative side that is insulted when you tell this artist, you know your game? It's gonna be called Prey. And you go like, I don't think it should, I think it's a mistake. That was director Rafael Colantonio of famed developer Arcane, lamenting years later the decision made by publisher Bethesda to market their 2017 FPS/immersive sim game as a reboot of the 2006 game Prey, which had been developed by a completely different studio. You see, after the relative commercial and critical success of the first Prey, a sequel had been greenlit. But years later, even following the 2009 acquisition of the rights by Bethesda, the game remained in a state of development hell and never even came close to a finished state. So when they had the opportunity to work with Arcane on what was actually designed as a spiritual successor to System Shock, Bethesda saw the opportunity they'd been waiting for to finally cash in on their IP. Bethesda figured they hardly even needed to market the game due to slapping the Prey name on it. The plan backfired, as people who didn't like the first Prey never gave this one a chance. People who did like it were confused about why this one was so different, and people who had never heard of it since it came out more than 10 years earlier by that point weren't swayed by the marketing ploy anyway. And so the game had to stand on its own with little to no marketing in a niche genre as an immersive sim blending RPG and puzzle elements. A game whose deliberate pace and depth, similar to the equally ill-fated System Shock 2 in 1999, required significant investment which few were willing to commit to. Sometimes perfectly good games that could have made it big and become blockbuster hits flop through circumstances either beyond their control or, worse yet, brought on by a single bad decision by the developer or publisher. Maybe the timing wasn't right, maybe the marketing fell flat, maybe the competition was just better, or just maybe the game failed due to an avoidable self-own. Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning is an action RPG that fuses epic storytelling with exhilarating gameplay, set in the vividly imagined world of Amalur, a realm of ancient lore created by fantasy author R.A. Salvatore with striking visuals from comic icon Todd McFarlane and direction by Elder Scrolls veteran Ken Rolston. You awaken as the Fateless One, the sole mortal unbound by destiny, resurrected from a battlefield massacre at the Well of Souls amid a cataclysmic war against the immortal Tuatha hordes threatening to plunge the land into eternal winter. Through 5 diverse lore-drenched regions teeming with elves, humans, and fae folk, you forge alliances, unravel conspiracies, and wield the power to shatter fates, culminating in a heroic saga of redemption and revolution that feels profoundly personal yet grandly cinematic. The publisher, 38 Studios, had a pretty decent budget when they took on the game, but this was funded almost entirely by debt, including a state loan and more borrowing from co-publisher EA. So they were pretty much betting the farm on the success of Kingdoms of Amalur. Perhaps Lincoln Chafee, governor of the state to whom the developer owed the money, Rhode Island, put it best. The game failed. The game failed. It needed to sell over 3 million copies just to break even. The failure to do so can mostly be pinned on unfortunate timing, I think. The game released just months after another action RPG you may have heard of, The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim. Considering the massive success that game achieved, it was just impossible for Kingdoms of Amalur to get the press it needed to do big numbers. As for 38 Studios, they would go bankrupt a few months later, leaving the taxpayers of Rhode Island holding the bag. Spec Ops The Line is a unique third-person shooter that daringly subverts the genre's expectations by delivering a haunting narrative of psychological descent and moral reckoning in a sand-swept Dubai apocalypse. Tasked with locating the rogue Colonel John Conrad and his damned 33rd Battalion, your mission spirals into a nightmarish odyssey inspired by Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now. The interesting narrative focus of the game was its key selling point. Unfortunately, publisher 2K decided that it was too great a risk to be upfront about it in the marketing, instead trying to market the game as a generic third-person military shooter to appeal to the Call of Duty crowd. A writer for the game, Sean Friesen, spoke about this in a 2025 Reddit AMA, saying, "The marketing didn't really push the unique parts of the game enough. We were actually instructed during press tours to downplay a lot of the game's message to try to capture the COD crowd. And for some reason, we were trying to avoid pissing off the UAE, which seems silly to me." That last point is an interesting one, given that careful efforts around marketing didn't end up saving the game from being banned in the UAE anyway, for depicting the country in a state of destruction. Writer Walt Williams spoke in an interview about another challenge with marketing the game, explaining, "It totally was a difficult game to market without giving away the reasons to play it. And we all knew this was going to be a problem until the game shipped. We always felt like it wasn't a game that people would understand until they could get their hands on the full game. Spec Ops would go on to flop, since Call of Duty players saw little reason to give a new franchise a shot, and few others were even made aware of what actually made it stand out if only you gave it a chance. The Secret World stands out as a bold MMORPG that reimagines the genre by weaving ancient myths, urban legends, and modern conspiracies into a gripping contemporary narrative. What elevates this game is its fearless innovation, no traditional levels or rigid classes. Instead, a flexible ability wheel lets you mix abilities from any of 9 different weapon types, from assault rifles to blood magic, on the fly, encouraging experimentation and personalization. Combat shifts fluidly between tab targeting and action styles, while investigation missions turn gameplay into clever puzzles demanding real-world Google searches via an in-game browser to crack codes or decode symbols. This ARG-style depth, paired with atmospheric horror, creates an immersive sandbox for story lovers and tinkerers alike. Now, often with MMORPGs, what you see is a little bit of a slow burn, where the game builds a dedicated fan base that logs in regularly, and then through word of mouth or continued developer efforts, the game gets bigger and bigger. So right after launch, when people started flocking into the game and reception from both critics and players was pretty good, things were looking quite promising. This despite heavy competition from Diablo III, which had come out only 2 months earlier. Then disaster struck. Only 1 month after The Secret World had come out, the very successful Guild Wars 2 was released by ArenaNet. Then a month after that, Blizzard came out with the Mists of Pandaria expansion to the World of Warcraft. The 1-2-3 punch from competitors just proved too much for a brand new IP without name recognition to overcome. Amazingly, developer Funcom was able to hang on and just about save the game by switching to a buy-to-play model later in the year, which led to an influx of new players the game needed to stay afloat. And believe it or not, you can still play the game today, in a sense, as of 2025, following a rebranding to Secret World Legends in 2017. Battleborn, released in 2016 by Gearbox Software, is a vibrant hero shooter with MOBA elements. What makes it shine is its roster of 30 quirky, customizable heroes, each with unique abilities inspired by Gearbox's signature flair, well known from their other popular games like Borderlands. The game's cel-shaded art, witty voice acting, and seamless co-op integration create addictive, replayable fun that captures the joy of heroic ensemble battles. Launching on a Tuesday, things looked promising at first. People generally liked the game, despite a bit of a steep learning curve and some minor technical issues. But then the weekend hit, and Blizzard released an open beta for another hero shooter you just might have heard of, Overwatch. Almost 10 million people participated in the Overwatch beta that weekend, and many would make the decision to continue playing the game when it came out later that month. Almost all hype for Battleborn completely died. To their credit, Gearbox and publisher 2K continued supporting the game, with 2K CEO Strauss Zelnick remarking the following year, "So with regard to Battleborn, we're being very frank about where we are, because we're a transparent company. We're still delivering new content to Battleborn. Audiences love Battleborn. We still have virtual currency coming for Battleborn. We're not counting it out for a minute. We're just telling you where we're at now." Support was eventually ended though a couple years later, and the game's servers were completely shut down in early 2021. Lawbreakers, developed by Boss Key Productions and released in August 2017, was a free-to-play hero shooter published by Korean giant Nexon. And if you're hearing that date and thinking about what we just went over with Battleborn, you're probably coming to the correct conclusion that the writing was basically on the wall before the game even launched. If Overwatch didn't exist, I think Lawbreakers would have had a shot, later summarized Cliff Bleszinski, formerly of Epic Games. He described the reaction of the devs when they first watched Blizzard's trailer for their competitor's game, saying, "Oh god, we're fucked." And fucked they were. There was lots to like about Lawbreakers, especially its focus on unmonetized skill expression, eschewing things like loot boxes and battle passes that disrupt the flow of other games, and instead delivering tight, exhilarating rounds that felt like a natural evolution of the old arena shooter formula pioneered by the likes of Unreal Tournament. The colorful CEO has racked his brain for anything else he could have done differently, admitting in 2020 to one other factor he thought might have put the final nail in the coffin. One big epiphany I had was that I pushed my own personal political beliefs in a world that was increasingly divided. Instead of the story being, "This game looks neat," it became, "This is the game with the woke bro trying to push his hacky politics on us with gender-neutral bathrooms." Instead of "These characters seem fun," it was, "This is the studio with the CEO who refuses to make his female characters sexier." Instead of "Who am I going to choose?" it became, "White dude shoehorns diversity into his game and then smells his own smug farts in interviews," instead of just letting the product speak for itself. It's a fairly early example of a relatively new issue that would come to divide the gaming landscape in the decade that followed in a very real and very unfortunate way. Bleszinski and his studio, Boss Key Productions, had one more kick at the can the following year with Radical Heights, a free-to-play third-person battle royale shooter that immerses players in a gloriously over-the-top 1980s alternate history America, where the Cold War never fully thawed and capitalism reigned supreme in the form of a twisted game show. Set in the sun-soaked neon-lit town of Radical Heights, players drop in as contestants hosted by the eccentric Marigold Gladstone, competing for fame, fortune, and survival in 100-player matches filled with satirical flair. The desperate attempt to pivot the company to the battle royale genre achieved some lukewarm positive reception. Becoming right after the catastrophic flop of Lawbreakers, the game carried baggage of distrust, and some critics and players viewed it as just another desperate cash grab from a studio chasing fads instead of innovating. While gimmicks like the 80s game show theme, shifting storm grids, and vending machine weapons added novelty, they felt like superficial attention grabbers rather than meaningful advancements, failing to carve out a unique niche in the genre sufficient to differentiate it from PUBG or Fortnite. Boss Key Productions shut down just a month after Radical Heights entered early access. Mario & Luigi: Bowser's Inside Story is a 2009 RPG created by Japanese developer Alpha Dream. This was the third game in the Mario & Luigi series, which had proven a hit especially for fans of Mario RPG games, but also the broader Nintendo audience more generally. Fast forward to 2017, and following the modest success of the most recent entry in the series, Paper Jam, Alpha Dream decided to go back to their roots and do a 3DS remake of the first game, Superstar Saga. The remake had updated graphics, of course, and various quality of life improvements, but also added a fun new storyline called Minion Quest: The Search for Bowser, with an RTS battle system. The remake did well enough to encourage the developer to try a repeat, this time with a remake of Bowser's Inside Story, the third game in the series. Similar to the first remake, the idea would be to bring a fresh coat of paint to the original, including modern graphics and remastered music, while also introducing new content in the form of Bowser Jr.'s Journey, which focuses on Bowser Jr.'s perspective during the events of the game. Despite the Nintendo Switch already having come out almost 2 years earlier, Alpha Dream opted to develop the remake for the 3DS, which was really aging at this point and basically already past the end of its lifespan. 3DS game sales had fallen more than 50% year over year compared to when the Paper Jam remake had come out, and they were already down at that point from the year before. Combine this with a certain level of series fatigue and a perception that there just wasn't enough new content to make the purchase worthwhile, especially considering you could still play the original due to the 3DS's backwards compatibility, and the result was a huge miss. The game became one of the worst-selling Mario games of all time, with a lifetime total of only 34,000 copies. Alpha Dream declared bankruptcy the following year. Sorcery is a PS3 exclusive action-adventure game that harnesses the PlayStation Move to deliver an enchanting tale of magic and heroism. You play as Finn, a spirited young apprentice wizard under the tutelage of the wise Dash, who must venture into the mystical fairy kingdoms drawn from Irish folklore to retrieve a forbidden grimoire and defeat the malevolent Nightmare Queen whose legions threaten eternal darkness. The game's true magic lies in its groundbreaking motion controls, transforming the Move controller into a versatile wand for spellcasting. You gesture with the remote to unleash 5 elemental powers: fiery blasts, icy freezes, crackling lightning, swirling winds, or earthen barriers, each feeling organic and responsive, elevating combat into a ballet of arcane flair. Complementing this are inventive puzzles, potion brewing via virtual cauldron stirring, and light exploration, creating fluid, satisfying gameplay that rewards creativity. The only real complaint was the relatively short length of the game, clocking in at only around 8 hours. Sorcery left a lot of players longing for more. Had the game come out for the Wii, it might have done a little better. Unfortunately, Sony's answer to the Wii, the Move, did not live up to expectations. While they did ultimately ship millions of units of the Move, it remained a niche platform where little-known innovators that chose it as their exclusive home found it very difficult to find mass appeal. Following the sustained success of the Smash Bros. Franchise, various others have tried their own takes at crossover fighter games, and Sony was no exception. With a large and impressive roster of PlayStation heroes to choose from, Sony put a lot of resources towards PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, forming an entire studio called Superbot Entertainment to focus on its development. There was limitless potential with a game like this, which Sony was hoping would launch a whole franchise with sequels and DLCs already planned. bringing together an iconic roster of 20+ heroes and villains from Sony's storied franchises including Kratos from God of War, Nathan Drake from Uncharted, Sly Cooper, and even quirky favorites like Parappa the Rapper and Sackboy from Little Big Planet. PlayStation All-Stars differentiated itself with its innovative All-Star power system, where instead of depleting health bars, players build AP by landing hits, grabs, and item pickups to unleash escalating super moves, from level 1 blasts to devastating level 3 ultimates that instantly KO your foe. The mechanic encourages aggressive combo-heavy playstyles tailored to each character's unique moveset, blending platforming combat flair with an element of strategic depth. But the simple truth is, despite the iconic nature of the combatants, they just couldn't compete with the ubiquity of Nintendo's lineup. Sony just didn't have the kind of long-standing cultural impact of Nintendo's first-party characters, and where it came close, like with Lara Croft, Crash Bandicoot, and Spyro the Dragon, the characters were conspicuously absent from the game, either owing to licensing problems or perhaps held back for later DLCs. PlayStation All-Stars did make its money back, but ended up far below expectations that would be needed for any kind of follow-up work like a sequel to be committed. If you walked into a GameStop in the early to mid 2010s, then you probably have vivid memories of countless copies of Zombie U with its eye-catching box art lining the shelves. Of course, part of the reason why so much shelf space was dedicated to Ubisoft's first-person survival horror title is that frankly there weren't a whole lot of other third-party titles available for sale for Nintendo's floundering home console, the Wii U. A lack of confidence in the Wii U's sales performance made third parties wary of investing in big titles for the system, and this started a vicious cycle where a lack of good games made the sales situation even worse. This left developers who did give the console a shot, like Ubisoft in this case, with disappointing sales and mounting financial losses. Yves Guillemot, the CEO of Ubisoft, when asked whether Zombie U did well, revealed, "Zombie U was not profitable, not even close. As such, there are no plans or even desire for a sequel." The company tried to recoup costs via limited re-releases on the PS4, Xbox One, and PC a few years later, but none of these sold well enough to recover the game's budget or its reputation, which many consider a shame since fans, especially of the original for the Wii U, found a lot of innovations like the permadeath zombification system to be very memorable and worthwhile. Titanfall 2, a follow-up to the first Titanfall game 2 years earlier, is a standout FPS that fuses on-foot agility sequences with colossal mech warfare, delivering a fresh take on multiplayer and single-player experiences alike. Set 5 years after the events of the original, its gripping campaign follows Jack Cooper, a resourceful militia rifleman thrust into the role of pilot after a devastating ambush. The elevated gameplay involves a seamless blend of hyper-fluid parkour, including wall running, double jumping, grappling, and sliding, turning every arena into a vertical playground of chaos. Pilots dart between cover and foes in hectic skirmishes and then call in customizable titans for thunderous tactical brawls, each with unique abilities like vortex shields or laser cores. Titanfall 2 was critically acclaimed, and EA expected it to sell around 10 million copies in the first year, confident that it would do so even with a challenging launch window right between Battlefield 1, their own game, and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. Their rationale was that there probably wasn't a lot of overlap between Battlefield and Titanfall player bases. But they were wrong. First year sales were only around half of the 10 million goal, following a dismal first week that reached only a quarter of the launch week sales of the first Titanfall game. The crowded market made it really hard for a AAA FPS to make the kind of splash it needed to in order to turn a reasonable profit. Despite the disappointing sales, EA and developer Respawn Entertainment knew there was a strong foundation here and weren't ready to abandon the series. Rebranding as Apex Legends for the next release and shifting towards a free-to-play battle royale hero shooter genre, Respawn created a massive hit, with Apex Legends attracting 50 million players in just the first month. Sleeping Dogs began life as a true crime series under publisher Activision Blizzard in 2008, but after multiple delays and budget issues, it was ultimately cancelled in 2011. That is, until Square Enix picked it up 6 months later and revived the project, leading to the action-adventure Grand Theft Auto rival that finally came out in 2012. Glowing reviews from critics focused on fluid martial arts combat with combo-driven brawls that incorporate environmental grapples and counters. Paired with agile driving sequences, precise cover shooting, and a familiar heat system that ramps up police pursuits, Sleeping Dogs has all the elements that fans of this sort of game had come to expect and more. But despite the critical acclaim that followed, the game's commercial performance fell short of expectations, with Square Enix citing its sluggish sales, along with other disappointments like Tomb Raider and Hitman Absolution, as a factor in a $68 million loss for the fiscal year. Square's marketing efforts for Sleeping Dogs were widely considered as poor, failing to build sufficient hype or awareness, especially amidst a crowded field that included other open-world crime games like GTA 4, which was still going strong at the time, bolstered by the release of acclaimed DLCs like The Ballad of Gay Tony. A planned sequel and spin-off were both cancelled, along with a film adaptation that had already entered production. But despite the commercial failure for Square Enix, Sleeping Dogs actually proved a profitable endeavor for developer United Front Games, who went on to make several other big-budget games in the coming years. Trouble would catch up to them eventually though, as 4 years later the studio suddenly announced its closure, only a month after they had released their newest game Smash and Grab to Steam Early Access. With a total budget of $50 million, Darksiders II ranked among the most expensive video games of all time when it came out in 2012. Publisher THQ needed a big win to turn the tide of rising debt that was rapidly becoming a serious problem that threatened to sink the company. The sequel to 2010's Darksiders, which had sold around 1 million copies and garnered a fair bit of positive attention, Darksiders 2 is a fluid, acrobatic hack and slash where you play as Death, using your dual scythes to carve through angelic and demonic forces in satisfying combos, augmented by a crow companion for aerial assaults and scouting. A Diablo-inspired loot system, dual skill trees, and gear upgrades encourage replayability and lend the game a fun ARPG twist. Like its predecessor, Darksiders 2 was well received and actually outsold the first game within just a few months. But even still, the bloated budget of the game made it impossible to turn a profit. CEO of rival publisher Nordic said in an interview, "Darksiders is a top product. THQ spent $50 million making Darksiders 2. We can produce a product of the same quality but for a lower cost. $50 million is ridiculous. I can't afford that." When THQ went bankrupt later that year, it was Nordic themselves who purchased the studio, rebranding as THQ Nordic. The company did continue the series with 2018's Darksiders 3, the sales of which fell off a cliff compared to the second entry, but due to shrewd budget controls, still earned a profit. Another game that suffered from budget spiraling out of control is 2014's Sunset Overdrive. Making matters worse for this one though, as it came out in a crowded late October field amid a flood of major titles like Assassin's Creed Unity, Far Cry 4, and Dragon Age Inquisition. And legendary developers Insomniac Games had negotiated an exclusivity deal with Microsoft for launch on the Xbox One only. So with three big factors against it, the high budget, crowded launch window, and exclusivity on the Xbox One, which remember suffered pretty dismal sales in its first few years, Sunset Overdrive was fighting an uphill battle. Miraculously, a complete catastrophe was averted and the game didn't result in a loss. Au contraire, it actually resulted in a massive windfall profit for Insomniac of $567, according to documents unveiled following a ransomware leak in 2023. Not exactly gangbusters numbers. And it's a shame too, because Sunset Overdrive is a vibrant, thrilling open-world jaunt featuring truly intriguing gameplay, ditching cover mechanics popular in many other action-adventure games at the time in exchange for seamless rail grinding, wall running, object bouncing, mid-air acrobatic fun. Critics loved the game, and so did those players who found it in the midst of all the challenges. Creative director Marcus Smith has expressed his desire to revisit the game in the years since, but so far nothing's materialized. 2012's Syndicate is an attempt to reboot a series that began back in 1993 with isometric real-time tactical gameplay, continuing with a follow-up entry, Syndicate Wars, a few years later. But publisher EA elected this time to go with fairly new studio Starbreeze Studios, following the closure of previous developers Bullfrog Productions. The result was a completely different sort of game, trading the tactical gameplay of the originals for a first-person shooter format. This decision might have been alright, alienating some fans but opening up the universe to a much larger potential player base, but instead Syndicate merely became another generic FPS in the eyes of many, where it was forced to compete for attention with similar titles like Deus Ex. So while the story was great, featuring excellent voice acting by famous actors like Brian Cox and Rosario Dawson, who brought gravitas and believability to the game, and gameplay was considered good overall, it just couldn't stand out in a niche that was so different from its origins. Worsening the situation, the market for Syndicate was made even smaller by the game's publisher's EA's insistence on making the game exclusive to their Origin service, eliminating a lot of sales that might have come from Steam. And the game even wound up being added to a list of games considered harmful to minors in Germany and banned outright in Australia due to excessive violence, cutting off even more key markets. Renegade Ops is a thrilling top-down vehicular combat shooter that captures the explosive joy of arcade classics with a modern twist, delivering non-stop action across stunning, destructible environments. Developer Avalanche of Just Cause fame designed here a game that sticks out for its unpretentious, over-the-top glee. Vehicles range from agile jeeps to tank-like behemoths, each packing special weapons like airstrikes or rapid-fire barrages, rewarding skillful driving and shooting in a fluid RPG-infused progression system. It's a shameless throwback that's ridiculously fun, with excellent level design that encourages replayability through high scores and hidden objectives. But the game failed to catch on with modern gamers on either the Xbox Live Arcade, the PC, or the PS3, owing to an almost complete lack of marketing efforts by Sega that meant a lot of fans of this style of thing, twin-stick shooters reminiscent of 90s arcade games, didn't even become aware of Renegade Ops. The generic-sounding title and game's short length, which meant memories of the fun faded too quickly to generate a lot of word of mouth, exacerbated the problem. And so Renegade Ops came and went pretty unnoticed, but if you're nostalgic for a modern take on a genre that doesn't get all that much love these days, you can still pick this one up on Steam, at least as of 2025. Crysis 3 is so far our masterpiece. It is better than Crysis 2, it is better than Crysis 1, technically and creatively and storytelling, all aspects. But there's a certain fatigue level with the old generation of consoles currently. The markets are down. People's expectations are much more radical than the current generation of games are doing. I think the new generation of consoles will reinvigorate that and help to elevate that again, and elevate new concepts of gaming which old platforms are right now limiting to. Thus spoke German developer Crytek's CEO Svat Yerli, explaining the disappointing sales of Crysis 3 despite a considerable leap forward compared to the first two games, at least in his opinion. EA, the game's publisher, also said Crysis 3 failed to meet their expectations. And sure, it makes sense that they would, considering like others on this list, it had an absolutely enormous budget for a video game in 2013, topping $65 million. And while what was delivered was indeed impressive, particularly visually, it was really difficult to evoke the sense of awe that the first game in the series did, with hardware, we're talking the PS3 and Xbox 360 here, that was going on 8 years old. And the PC version, in classic Crysis fashion, couldn't even be fully realized on most PCs unless you had a pretty advanced rig. So in order to do the kind of sales a game of this scale needs in 2013, you needed to do something beyond the advanced graphics that the marketing was focused on for Crysis 3, which meant that a lot of gamers saw little reason to pick up the game over others in the FPS market like BioShock Infinite and Battlefield 3, titles that stood out for compelling narratives or established multiplayer communities. There's a whole new way for games to flop that started to become a lot more prominent in the second decade of the new millennium. Major consumer backlash brought on by disagreements with choices made by developers, amplified by online discourse. While it's true that even as far back as the 90s, games failed due to accusations of false advertising, like with Battlecruiser 3000 AD, or due to cultural opposition, like with Night Trap, it was in the 2010s where things really came to a head and consumers started to push back in an organized way on certain things they considered too egregious to support. If you were to actually think about it, these characters are just functions. They're just doing things. Magneto, case in point, is a favorite because he has an 8-way dash and he's really fast, right? So our most technical players, all they want to do is triangle jump and that kind of stuff. Well, guess what? Nova can do the same thing. Captain Marvel can do the same thing. Ultron can do the same thing. Go ahead and try them out. This was the flippant response from Peter Rosas of Capcom USA when asked why Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite ditched the famous X-Men characters popular from previous entries in the series. The statement became a focal point for what developed into a strong resistance to the game as fans felt that Capcom had betrayed the franchise's identity out of either a misguided attempt to save money or a misunderstanding of what people are really looking for in a game like this. Certain gameplay changes, such as the switch from 3v3 battles with assists to a 2v2 tag system, also alienated core fans. Adding insult to injury was the early announcement of DLC characters, which released only a month after the game came out. Some of the DLC characters, like Black Panther, were even featured in the story mode but were locked behind paywalls, frustrating fans who felt core content was deliberately withheld from the initial release. Valve's Artifact, a digital collectible card game set in the Dota 2 universe, launched on November 28, 2018 amid high anticipation but swiftly became one of the company's biggest flops, losing 99% of its players within mere months. A rare miss for Valve, with the main reason being its controversial monetization model, which alienated both casual and competitive audiences. Unlike free-to-play rivals like Hearthstone, Artifact required a $20 upfront purchase for base access and 10 card packs. Players then had to buy additional packs or event tickets to acquire more cards, with a full collection costing around $330 at launch. This pay-to-play structure offered very little meaningful free progression, forcing constant spending for viable decks, especially at a high level. The pay-to-win perception fueled outrage. Wealthier players could dominate by flooding the Steam marketplace with purchases, while free players lagged behind. An infamous Steam review quipped, "The most powerful card is your credit card." This became a meme because it captured the sentiment of disappointment perfectly. Crowds booed at the game's teaser trailer reveal in 2017, and post-launch, rating bombs tanked its visibility. Backlash snowballed as concurrent players plummeted from over 60,000 to under 1,000 by March 2019, prompting Valve to downsize the team and halt all updates. Designer Richard Garfield later admitted that the revenue model, though innovative, misjudged player expectations for accessibility. Yeah, no shit, Richard. Command & Conquer 4: Tiberian Twilight, released in March 2010 as the capstone to the storied Tiberium saga, arriving amid sky-high fan expectations for a grand RTS finale to the epic saga. Instead, it bombed spectacularly, earning a middling Metacritic score of 64 out of 100 from critics and scathing user backlash that tanked sales and effectively euthanized the franchise. The triple whammy of intrusive DRM, a jarring gameplay overhaul, and cynical asset recycling fueled a firestorm of outrage, turning hype into infamy. The decision to use an always-online DRM was the first issue. In 2025, it almost seems a bit quaint to remember the controversy surrounding Always Online, but believe it or not, this was seen as a big deal, and an affront especially to longtime single-player fans of franchises like Command & Conquer. Adding insult to injury, players reported frequent crashes, failed authentications, and hours lost to server hiccups. Worse was the radical gutting of RTS staples. Beloved mechanics like base building, harvester economies, and sprawling unit production vanished, replaced by a streamlined class system with mobile crawlers as roving HQs. It felt like a console-ified MOBA hybrid, dumbed down for accessibility at the expense of depth. When people became aware that Command & Conquer 4 was basically a lazy cash grab remix of a scrapped free-to-play MOBA, this combined with other issues and made the $60 price tag feel like a slap in the face. The backlash was swift and lethal, resulting in review-bombed scores, boycotted forums, and dismal sales that barely recouped costs. The fourth, and as it turned out, at least so far, the final Deus Ex game, Mankind Divided, stumbled commercially, selling roughly 1.15 million copies on Steam by mid-2018 and failing to hit the 3 million needed to recoup its astronomical $70 million budget, marking it as a definite flop despite critical acclaim for the game itself. The Augment Your Pre-Order program epitomized corporate greed in a, you gotta hand it to them, a uniquely innovative way, gamifying incentives like a pyramid scheme. Bonuses like digital comics and weapons unlocked only if enough players pre-bought collectively, pressuring individuals to evangelize for corporate gain. Dubbed abusive and preposterous, it sparked outrage, forcing Square Enix to scrap it after a resounding fan ire just weeks before launch. But they had eroded trust and turned pre-launch hype into cautious skepticism. When the game did launch, microtransactions drew fire for paywalls on credits and unlocks, feeling exploitative and out of place in a narrative-driven RPG. Critics argued they unbalanced a game that was clearly designed without them, fueling boycotts and review bombing. Compounding problems were bizarre marketing missteps, including promotional art with phrases like "Aug Lives Matter" and "mechanical apartheid," which were seen as insensitive by some people at the time, promoting IDOS to issue an apology for the unfortunate coincidence. Neither the gaffes nor the apology went over well with a certain segment of consumers. Collectively, the controversies overshadowed the game's strong stealth RPG base, stunting word of mouth and ultimately sales. Star Wars Battlefront II launched in 2017 amid massive hype as a visually stunning multiplayer shooter, but it quickly became a cautionary tale of instead corporate greed, flopping spectacularly due to explosive backlash over its loot box system intertwined with an excruciating grind-heavy progression model. At the heart of the controversy was the game's card-based upgrade system, where loot crates, containing crucial enhancements, were the primary progression mechanic. These crates could be earned slowly through gameplay or purchased with real money via crystals, effectively paywalling competitive viability. Players faced a brutal grind. Basic cards were gated behind randomized drops, forcing hours of repetitive matches to scrape together resources. This was exacerbated by locked iconic heroes, epitomized by Darth Vader. Unlocking the Sith Lord required 60,000 credits, equivalent to roughly 40 hours of non-stop play. Alternatively, impatient players could of course spend about $30 on crystal packs to buy loot crates and accelerate the process, highlighting the pay-to-win imbalance that alienated casual fans and hardcore grinders alike. The outrage erupted pre-launch, with beta testers decrying the system as predatory. Petitions amassed over 200,000 signatures, Steam reviews tanked to overwhelmingly negative, and regulators in Belgium and the Netherlands even halted sales, classifying loot boxes as gambling. Sales projections cratered, with the game underperforming by millions of units compared to its 2015 predecessor. EA's response only fueled the fire. On Reddit, a community manager working for the company defended the model in a now infamous post beginning with the line, "The intent is to provide players with a sense of pride and accomplishment for unlocking different heroes." The post got almost 700,000 downvotes and was recognized by Guinness as the most downvoted comment in history. Battlefront 2 did wind up with around 9 million copies sold after making some much needed changes, though this was far short of EA's 10 million target, a failure EA's leadership ascribed to the loot box controversy. Metal Gear Survive was Konami's attempt to revive the Metal Gear franchise without its famed creator Hideo Kojima. Kojima, whose intricate plots and gameplay innovations defined the series, had clashed with Konami over budgets during Metal Gear Solid 5's development. Konami restructured the company, demoting him, banning his name from marketing, and canceling projects like Silent Hills, culminating eventually in his 2015 exit to form Kojima Productions. Fans, viewing Kojima as the franchise's heart, boycotted Survive as a hollow imitation, with Kojima himself publicly disavowing things like the game's zombie foes. This severed trust ensured backlash from the very moment of the announcement of the game. Worse, Survive cynically ditched Metal Gear's core identity of tactical sneaking, geopolitical satire, and narrative depth for instead a co-op survival grind in an alternate timeline. Players built bases and scavenged against interdimensional zombies via wormholes, sidelining stealth for repetitive resource farming and horde defense, a generic zombie apocalypse that fans felt mocked the series' legacy of cerebral intrigue. Microtransactions were the final straw, some of which were just ridiculous, like charging $10 for a second save slot. This pay-to-progress model, amid Konami's pivot as a company towards pachinko and mobiles, fueled accusations of greed, with fans decrying the whole game as a cash grab. Metal Gear Survive was a monumental failure, selling 95% fewer copies than Metal Gear Solid 5, and cementing Konami's descent into a mere shadow of their former selves. Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival, released for the Wii U in 2015, was a spin-off party game that deviated sharply from the series' life sim roots, resembling a lackluster Mario Party clone with board game mechanics centered on collecting happy points. After the massive success of 2012's New Leaf, with over 12 million copies sold, fans understandably anticipated another mainline entry. Instead, they got what many called a sellout, intended to do nothing but generate profits. The game's core flaw was its overt design as a vehicle to boost Amiibo sales. Director Aya Kiyogoku admitted, "We just wanted Animal Crossing Amiibo. We wanted the company to make Animal Crossing Amiibo, so that's why we made a game that works with them." Amiibos weren't optional. Full play required scanning figures and cards for characters, mini-games, and unlocks, turning it into a cumbersome paywall that alienated non-collectors. Eurogamer noted that Kiyogoku's admirably frank confession confirmed that Amiibo Festival was little more than a delivery device for Animal Crossing Amiibo. Commercially, the game bombed, selling just 490,000 units worldwide, far below mainline expectations. Reviewers decried the slow pacing, clunky NFC integration, and lack of depth, with one calling it torture and a cheap way for Nintendo to sell Amiibos. This misstep delayed a true sequel until the triumphant return of the series with Animal Crossing New Horizons in 2020, underscoring how prioritizing profit and cheap gimmicks over gameplay can erode trust and, at least temporarily, derail an entire beloved series. Wolfenstein Youngblood promised to continue the alternate history saga of the Wolfenstein franchise with BJ Blazkowicz's twin daughters Jess and Soph as protagonists. However, its pivot to co-op multiplayer and live service mechanics alienated core fans, contributing to its commercial and critical flop, with review scores plummeting to mostly negative on Steam amid widespread review bombing. The co-op shift transformed the traditionally linear, story-driven gameplay into a non-linear, hub-based structure optimized for two-player sessions. This meant that solo play relied on a brain-dead AI companion that failed at things like revives and combat itself, making boss fights and progression feel unbalanced and frustrating. The design encouraged repetitive map revisits for side quests, diluting the high-octane action fans loved in titles like The New Colossus. Compounding this, live service elements like RPG leveling gates, infinite enemy respawns, daily and weekly quests from ally Abby, and microtransactions for cosmetic gold bars infused a grindy looter-shooter vibe, evoking generic multiplayer titles like Destiny rather than Wolfenstein's focused fury. These padded a thin 10 to 15 hour campaign, prioritizing progression over narrative depth, with the protagonist sisters' quippy banter frankly clashing against the series' gritty lore. Fans felt deeply betrayed by Bethesda's marketing, which hyped trailers as a seamless Wolfenstein evolution while de-emphasizing the co-op primacy or the live service grind. This opacity especially sparked outrage, with players decrying it as a cynical cash grab that trashed the franchise's single-player legacy to bandwagon on modern multiplayer trends. Sales tanked below 1 million copies, stalling the series and eroding trust and confidence in Machine Games' vision for the future of Wolfenstein. 6 years before Wolfenstein Youngblood, Dead Space 3, the third entry in Visceral Games' acclaimed Dead Space survival horror series, failed for very similar reasons, with a pivotal departure from its roots ultimately contributing to its commercial underperformance and the franchise's hiatus. Under pressure from publisher EA to broaden appeal amid softening sales from Dead Space 2, developers shifted towards action-oriented gameplay, introducing online co-op multiplayer mid-production. This allowed a second player to control newcomer John Carver, altering puzzles, enemy AI, and spawning for shared sessions, features that hardliners said clashed with the series' solitary tension-building horror. Co-op diluted the psychological dread, they said, with asymmetrical hallucinations and voice command connect integration feeling tacked on and breaking immersion. EA also mandated microtransactions, letting players buy crafting resources with real money to upgrade weapons, stat boosts which were often superior to in-game options. Marketed as optional, they encouraged spending in both solo and co-op modes where resource scarcity could frustrate duos, pushing real money purchases for smoother progression. Sales actually topped US charts initially, but dropped 20% from Dead Space 2 after word of mouth hurt momentum, causing the game to fail to meet EA's targets and dooming planned sequels. Visceral Games was closed by EA a few years later, with the failure of Dead Space 3 seen as evidence of the developer's inability to adapt to the corporation's shift away from single-player focused narratives. Battlefield V aimed to revive the franchise's World War II roots, but instead became a commercial disappointment, selling just 7.3 million copies lifetime against Battlefield 1's 25 million 2 years earlier. Battlefield V earned its flop status largely from the moment the reveal trailer was released, showcasing honestly a pretty visually attractive and engaging entry that initially had a lot of people pretty hyped, but many focused on the inclusion of certain elements they decried as historical revisionism, such as female soldiers in frontline combat during World War II, including one with a prosthetic arm and wielding a cricket bat. Some saw this as overly pandering to modern sensitivities, while others saw it as an undesirable shift to a cartoonish style more befitting games for younger audiences such as Fortnite. Developer response exacerbated the uproar. EA Vice President Patrick Soderlund dismissed the opposition, saying, "There are a lot of female people who want to play, and male players who want to play a badass woman. This is a game, and we don't take any flack. We stand up for the cause because I think those people who don't understand it, well, you have two choices. Either accept it or don't buy the game. I'm fine with either or." This tone-deaf arrogance alienated the series' core male history buff audience, who felt lectured rather than engaged, leading to review bombing and pre-order cancellations. Patrick Soderlund left, or was asked to leave, the company later the same year. Compounding problems, Battlefield V pivoted hard to a live service model like many others on this list, emphasizing post-launch seasons over a robust single-player campaign, with monetization via cosmetic microtransactions that many viewed as pay-to-win adjacent. And delayed Battle Royale mode and content droughts failed to retain players, dropping concurrent users from peaks of 500,000 to under 10,000 by mid-2019. EA later blamed the flop on flaws in Battlefield V's single-player campaign, but analysts largely pinpointed the controversy and dismissive PR that followed as the sales killer, eroding trust and dooming the potentially lucrative live service vision to failure. If you've made it this far, we'd really appreciate if you would consider subscribing to our channel and liking the video. Your support means a lot.